Community Motors West Side, the GM Superstore next to Cinema West. Community Motors of Mason City, we give you more.
For those of you that weren't here at the last meeting, Curt Hartog from Pope is who the board agreed to hire last November meeting to do this report. And we're going to be passing out the slides, and then this is a copy of the report that the presentation will be given on those.
I was here last Tuesday, and I liked the weather a lot better. 50-degree day, it was like warming up the golf clubs. Now the snowshoes. It was really nice. Dang, you're hot.
Everybody get a copy of
I want
that
to
slide.
get that spread out quickly for the people that weren't here last time. I'm Curt Hartog. I'm an engineer with both infrastructure and environment, a senior technical manager out of our Lake Elmo, Minnesota office. Brian Hartoon is also here. He's from our Cedar Rapids office, a senior project manager and an engineer with both. As Bill mentioned, LNI asked us to prepare a report based on the potential impacts to the landfill of North Iowa from the CES proposed process. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, and understanding, brief understanding of gasification and pyrolysis. We also look at the landfill of North Iowa waste stream and what's actually coming in the gate. And then what impacts are going to happen. Provided some comments on the CES contract. That was under separate cover to Bill. And then we provided some recommendations that we're going to go over. Next slide. Quickly, if, from last time, gasification, if you're not aware of that process, it's a thermal process, it's not incineration. There's limited air and oxygen in the process and high temps. Waste pretreatment's typically needed. They typically have to shred the waste to get it down to a size to get it into the vessel. A lot of pilot plants out there. There's been a lot since 1970 that have tried this process, and of course, we haven't had a commercial plant, scale plant in North America yet. Next slide. To understand what happens in this process, when we go through a gasification or pyrolysis process, we first had to understand what goes in first. And so we took a look at the landfill of North Iowa waste stream in 2011, and Bill sent us just the raw data, and we kind of sifted through it. And then what we looked at is the statewide waste characterization the Iowa DNR did, and we said, well, let's just apply that on the municipal solid waste, that residential portion of the waste, and find out what comes out of this. Now, this site wasn't selected for a waste characterization, but it's pretty reflective of what the waste is in Iowa. We also wanted to look if there was any difference in morning or afternoon waste deliveries. That's going to create a lot of process problems in any process where you get a bunch of waste in the morning and none in the afternoon, or vice versa. And we looked at the MSW and C&D waste streams. Next slide. What we found out is in the morning and afternoon, it's kind of balanced. Your MSW comes in pretty balanced during the day, but as you can see, there's some significant change in the waste stream from January to December, with a peak sometime in June, which is typical of a landfill. You know, in the beginning part of the year, there's not a lot of waste generated. And of course, during the summer, there's quite a bit more. People get out and get active. Next slide. We also want to look at the peak, the average, and the minimums. And the takeaway really from this graph is the span, the difference in the waste stream every day from the peak, like 350, to a minimum of 50. So there's a large fluctuation in the waste stream in any one day that would need to be evaluated. Now, one of the things we did look at is that 50 is usually Saturday, because they're only open half a day. And so we also looked at that, and if you take that out, it raises it slightly, but there are days even during the week where you're only at about 100 tons, somewhere in that range. So then we took this data, And we looked at the Iowa waste characterization for residential MSW, and this is the output of their waste characterization and what's in the waste, so to speak. And we kind of sat back and said, okay, if I get this into a process, what happens to it? Well, obviously the metals, they're going to be recycled. You're not going to take glass, C&D waste, probably not. Plastics, hopefully you'll recycle those. Durable goods are, small durable goods. They probably have little value. Of course, there's a little bit of HHW in the waste, very little. And then there's other waste they called, which organic was about 5%. So what we said is the italic ones, the paper organics and the other organics down here in the other waste, likely to be good candidates for pyrolysis or plasma or gasification. So that was our starting point for our waste. So we looked at the gasification process and we said, okay, all this garbage they're getting into, we're going to somehow process it and get everything out that's not good, kind of the rejects. So we came out with only about 90 to 133 tons per day is what we expect would be coming into a vessel or some sort of vessel. And that's going to produce in the gasification process, based on some studies and some mostly European studies, roughly 3 to 4 tons of ash a day that obviously have to come back to the landfill of North Iowa to manage. There's also a tar component in there, that's part of the process, and there's of course syngas, and there's quite a bit of syngas produced from that quantity of waste. So for a gasification process, right now no commercial facilities. Enercam's probably going to be the first one up in Edmonton and maybe in Mississippi this year in 2012. They're well on their way. I met the project manager about 4 weeks ago, and they're going. There's 175 vendors out there right now that want to do some sort of gasification process with municipal solid waste. So there's 175 people around the United States knocking on doors to try to get a gasification process going. Landfill of North Iowa also wanted us, to look at economic issues, and are there any studies out there? And they're really limited. The economic studies are partials or somewhat, but SWANA published. SWANA is a trade group, Solid Waste Association of North America. The landfill people, I think Bill's a member of SWANA, I'm a member of SWANA. It's our trade group. They published a study in 2012 saying tip fees for these types of processes are $100 to $300 a ton. The capital costs run about $275,000 per ton per day of waste. So you take your 130 tons or so times 275, you're in that $35–36 million range. They also wanted to look at environmental considerations from gasification processes. The gasification processes that are poorly operated, poorly designed, typically have environmental issues. If a gasification process is well designed, well operated, the environmental issues go away. And they've demonstrated that in multiple plants, mostly in Europe and in Asia. You can do it. You just gotta know what you're doing. More or less is the answer. The pyrolysis process, same thing as gasification, except they don't allow you to air oxygen into the process. And it depends on the temperature. You can see the temperature is a little bit lower. There were 2 main plants in the United States in the 1970s that provided a lot of data on this process. There were volumes of books written on these 2 processes. One was in San Diego and one was in New York. And that's where we kind of got the data for, the next slide please, for our inputs and outputs. With syngas and oils and char, they have, the output is not an ash in pyrolysis, it's more of a char, it's a carbon, like a piece of coal, essentially. And depending on the temperature of the process, you get more or less of one or the other. So there's a variability in what's output when you're in a pyrolysis process. Next slide. They have kind of the same situation. No plants in North America. They seem to be very popular in Japan and Europe and Australia, where MSW is a portion of the feedstock, where they're using like a wood chip or auto shredder residue in one of the plants, and they're mixing it with MSW and sending it in. But there's no commercial plants in North America at this time. Again, limited economic studies, and the SWANA published paper that looks at $100 to $300 a ton for that process. On environmental issues, one of the challenges pyrolysis has is that tar formation. That's a concern. You know, you can be engineered out, but that's usually when they have issues in their emissions, it's from tar buildup. So the CDS plant, or the proposed plant that we've seen from CDS, both believe they can obtain air, water, and solid waste permits. The air quality issues, there's off-the-shelf air quality controls that you can use. The key is good engineering and then good operation. Water, same way. There's filtration processes. There's other processes they can use to clean their water up. And of course, a solid waste permit, they'll need just to handle the solid waste. And those are pretty prescriptive rules, what they have to do. So we came to the conclusion, you know, they're likely to be able to obtain those. Obviously, they'll probably have to do some sort of test or some sort of pilot run to make sure they can obtain air emissions. The ash and char, the residue, you know, you've got municipal solid waste coming in, it's unlikely it's going to be hazardous coming out. But there are, you know, standard tests. ASTM has standard tests to test that before it's disposed of at the landfill in North Iowa. And like we mentioned, all the liquids can really be cleaned. If they need to discharge them, they can be cleaned so they can be discharged. We were asked by the landfill of North Iowa to do a preliminary economic analysis, and you know, I'm not an accountant or a financial guru or anything like this, but we did kind of a back of the envelope analysis with a $35 million capital cost. Then the operations, we just took their staff and said, you're gonna have 53 people, and this is, you know, this is your average salary, and we got $2.6 million a year. Maintenance, we base that on $500,000 a year based on our experience with refuse-derived fuel plants. That's about what they're looking at for just a refuse-derived fuel plant. And then, of course, we assumed that you'd run 5.5 days, just like the landfill. And you'd get power to purchase at about 4 cents a kilowatt. We called Alliance and asked them, and they said, yeah, somewhere around 4, somewhere in there is probably where it's going to end up. In the end, we looked at that analysis, and you know, the recommendation was that you know, it's questionable for us. I mean, when we looked at it, we said something isn't adding up here. You know, so part of that is in our conclusions. Well, we'll look at that. We also were asked to look at the staffing for LNI. Based on what goes into that plant, what gets rejected, and what's going into the landfill of North Iowa now, it's probably not very good. I mean, you know, concrete, some of the other products that come into the door, there's really going to be no change in LNI staffing. In the landfill business, there's a break point at about 300 to 500 tons where you get a break where you're actually, you may want to add staff. Anything below that, you have to have a documented staff, which you have, that has to manage that waste. Your landfill life would be increased 25 to 30 years based on how much reject, how much actually goes into the plant, and what you get out. Closure, post-closure funds, there's really no impact to your dedicated fund, because the DNR requires you to pay up 10 years. In 10 years, if you open a new cell, you've only got 10 years to get fully funded. So whether that cell lasts 20 years or 10 years or 50 years, you only have 10 years. Then you got to be fully funded. The risks, ensure testing of anything that comes, you know, from the plant back to the landfill needs to be tested. And of course, an economic risk could rear its head if it's not solvent, if the plant is financially not solvent. LNI could be exposed to an economic risk to keep the plant open. So we wanted to, you know, alert the landfill of North Iowa to that. Next slide. So conclusions, you know, of course, both processes demonstrating the pilot scale pyrolysis and gasification. Pilot scales testing has been done. They both likely require waste pretreatment. You're going to have to hammer your waste into something small. You can't take a bag of garbage and just throw it in there. Economic studies are limited, but you know the tip fees are what's been reported. Environmental emissions, you know, off-the-shelf stuff, you can pretty much get it cleaned to meet EPA standards. Of course, the ash residue we talked about, the need to test that. We believe CES could reasonably obtain the permits. I mean, not knowing a lot about the plant, but, you know, with good engineering, good operation, it's reasonable to think that they could get their permits. All the staff would be retained, you get a little bit more life on your landfill. The economics are questionable for us on that plan. So our recommendations, we recommend LNI get further economic assurances from CES if they want to move forward with the project. That you participate in all the permit actions, all those permit actions, the air, the solid waste, and any water, that's going to be a public process, and LNI needs to be involved in that to make sure they get assurances placed in the permit that don't come back on the landfill. For example, if something fails a test, what happens to it? It should be in their permit, not in your permit. Detailed contract review, of course, to provide safeguards to LNI, protect their assets. And the last thing was consider an unsolicited proposal policy and process for LNI. With 175 vendors out there, there's going to be more people knocking on your door. How do you want to handle that as an organization? What's the process that they should go through to make this better and smoother for your evaluation of processes? And so that was one of the unsolicited proposal policy process. So with that, done.